gentle history of pottery, clay, and kilns at dusk. Chapter 1. Soft opening. At the edge of evening, when the light grows thin and the first coolness settles close to the ground, clay seems to belong naturally to the hour. It waits in riverbanks and fields, in quiet hollows where water has rested, in the soft places beneath grasses and reeds. Long before it became a bowl, a jar, a lamp, or a tile, it was simply earth softened by time. Pottery begins with this patient material. Clay is made from stone worn down over many ages, broken by weather, carried by streams, and settled in layers. It holds water gently, and because its particles are fine and flat, it can be pressed, smoothed, and shaped by the hand. To touch clay is to touch something both humble and ancient, something that has passed through mountains, rain, rivers, and silence. The earliest potters did not invent clay. They noticed it. They saw how wet earth could take the print of a foot, the curve of a palm, the mark of a woven basket. They saw how sun and fire could harden it. In many parts of the world, people discovered these things slowly, at different times, in different places. There was no single beginning, only many small beginnings, each as quiet as someone kneeling by water at dusk. Some of the oldest known fired clay objects are not vessels at all, but small figures and forms shaped tens of thousands of years ago. Later, as communities gathered seeds, cooked grains, stored water, and lived for longer stretches in one place, clay vessels became useful companions. A pot could hold what the hands could not hold for long. It could keep food dry, carry water, warm a stew near the fire, or rest in the corner of a room, steady and dependable. Imagine an early evening in a settlement near a river. Smoke rises low from hearths. The day's work is nearly done. Someone has brought a lump of clay from the bank and set it beside a mat. It is needed to remove air and stones. A thumb presses into the center. Fingers turn the shape slowly. The wall of a small bowl rises, uneven at first, then smoother. There is no hurry. The vessel grows through touch, not force. Before wheels and large kilns, many pots were formed by hand. Some were pinched from a single lump. Some were built from coils of clay, ring upon ring, joined and smoothed until they became jars. Others were pressed into baskets or against simple molds. Their surfaces might be left plain or touched with lines, shells, cords, reeds, or fingertips. Decoration in these early forms was often close to daily life. The mark of a tool, the rhythm of a woven pattern, the memory of a hand. Firing changed everything. A clay vessel dried in the sun is fragile and easily softened again by water. But clay placed in heat is transformed. In an open fire, or later in a pit, and later still in a kiln, it becomes ceramic, harder, more lasting, less willing to return to mud. This transformation is quiet but profound. Earth, water, air, and fire meet, and something useful remains. Tonight, as we begin this gentle history, we can think of pottery not as a grand invention, but as a long conversation between people and the earth beneath them. It is a history of bowls cooling in ash, jars lined along walls, hands learning the patience of shaping, and kilns glowing softly as daylight fades. The story begins low to the ground, beside water and fire, in the calm work of making a place for things to be held. Chapter 2. The first quiet traces. Long before pottery became bowls on shelves, jars in storehouses, or cups warmed by evening hands, clay rested in riverbanks and lake edges, waiting in silence. It was simply part of the earth, soft after rain, firm beneath the sun, marked by reeds, birds' feet, and the passing of small animals at dusk. People knew it first not as an invention, but as a familiar material underfoot, cool and yielding, something that could take a shape and remember it for a while. The earliest traces of fired clay are very old indeed. In different parts of the world, people discovered that clay changed when it met heat. It hardened. It kept its form. It could survive where ordinary mud would soften and return to the ground. Some of the earliest known fired clay objects were not vessels, but small figures, simple forms shaped by hand and placed near fire. At Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, tiny clay figurines were made more than 25,000 years ago. They were not yet pots for cooking or storage, but they show that human hands had begun to notice clay's quiet promise. A person might have learned this slowly, without any single bright moment of discovery. A lump of clay near a hearth, a lining of mud inside a basket, a patch of damp earth hardened by embers. In the low light after sunset, such changes could be seen and felt. Clay that had once been soft became stone-like, though still lighter and more fragile than stone. It did not need to be carved from a mountain. It could be gathered, pressed, smoothed, and left to dry. Thousands of years later, in East Asia, people began making some of the earliest known pottery vessels. Sites in China, such as Xian Rendang Cave, have yielded fragments of pottery that may be around 20,000 years old. These pieces are humble now, broken shards, small sections of once whole forms. Yet they speak gently of daily life. They suggest containers that could hold food, water, or heated contents, made by people who lived close to caves, forests, rivers, and seasonal paths. There were no spinning wheels at first, no tall kilns with carefully controlled temperatures. Early pots were shaped slowly by hand. Clay might be mixed with sand, crushed shell, plant fiber, or bits of older pottery to help it dry and fire without cracking. The maker could pinch the clay upward from a rounded base, or build the walls with coils, pressing one soft ring upon another. Fingers smoothed the joints. A stone, shell, or piece of wood might leave a mark. Some surfaces carried impressions from cord, fabric, or basketry, as though the vessel had borrowed a pattern from another craft. Firing, too, was simple in the beginning. Pots could be placed in or near open fires, surrounded by fuel, covered with ash, and heated as evenly as possible. The colors that emerged were often earthy and varied: brown, gray, reddish, blackened in places by smoke. Each vessel carried signs of flame and chance. Some would crack, some would survive, each success taught a little more. These first quiet traces do not tell a story of sudden mastery. They tell of noticing, repeating, waiting, and learning from the earth. In the hush of early evenings, as fires settled and smoke thinned into the dark, clay was becoming something new. A companion to memory, meals, warmth, and the long human habit of making shelter from what lay close at hand. Chapter 3: Rooms, Roads, and Weather. As evening settles over the old places of making, pottery begins to seem less like an object and more like a quiet companion to daily life. A bowl waits near a hearth. A jar rests in the corner of a room. A small lamp, shaped by fingers and fire, holds a little oil against the dark. Long before written records became common, clay was already keeping company with people in their houses, along their roads, and beneath the changing weather. In many early villages, pottery belonged first to the room. It held grain, water, milk, oil, and salt. It stood near doorways, under shelves, beside sleeping mats, and close to cooking fires. Archaeologists often find broken pieces of vessels in the floors and courtyards of ancient homes. And from these fragments, they learn how people ate, stored, traded, and repaired. A cracked jar might be mended with small holes and cord. A chipped bowl might continue in service for years. Clay did not need to be perfect to be useful. It could be worn, smoke-darkened, and still trusted. The shape of a pot often followed the shape of a life. In a room where grain was stored through winter, large vessels with narrow mouths helped keep out dust and insects. In kitchens, rounded cooking pots sat well among embers, their darkened bases showing the slow work of many meals. In places where people carried water from wells or rivers, jars were made with shoulders and necks suited to lifting, pouring, and balancing. Even a handle was a kind of memory, shaped around the human hand. Beyond the room, pottery traveled. It moved along paths between settlements, on the backs of animals in carts, and in boats that followed rivers and coastlines. Some vessels carried wine, olive oil, fish sauce, or preserved foods. Others carried perfumes, pigments, medicines, or offerings. In the ancient Mediterranean, amphorae with pointed bases could be stacked in the holds of ships, fitting together like quiet rows of sleeping birds. Their shapes became recognizable, and sometimes their stamps or marks told of workshops, owners, or places of origin. Roads changed pottery too. When people exchanged goods, they exchanged habits of making. A pattern impressed into wet clay might appear far from its first home. A firing method, a painted line, or a useful vessel form could pass from one community to another without fanfare. The movement was often slow, carried by merchants, migrants, potters, marriages, and neighbors. Clay remembered these meetings in small ways. A curve borrowed here, a glaze attempted there, a new temper mixed into the body of a pot. Weather also had its say. Clay had to be dug when the ground allowed it. It had to be cleaned, kneaded, shaped, and dried with patience. Too much sun could crack a vessel before it reached the kiln. Too much damp could slow the work for days. Wind might help dry rows of pots, or it might fill them with dust. In colder regions, potters planned around frost. In warmer lands, they watched the heat and shade. The workshop was never separate from the season. Kilns, too, belonged to weather. A firing needed fuel, air, timing, and attention. Damp wood smoked differently from dry wood. A strong wind could change the draft. Rain might delay a firing or cool a kiln too quickly. At dusk, when the day's work softened and the heat of the kiln settled into its walls, a potter might listen as much as look, sensing the fire's progress through color, sound, and long experience. So pottery lived between shelter and journey, between hand and climate. It was made in rooms, carried on roads, and shaped by weather before it ever touched a meal or a shelf. In its quiet durability, it held not only water and grain, but the calm rhythm of human days. Waking, working, traveling, returning, and resting again as the light withdrew. Chapter 4: Tools and Daily Rhythms. In the quiet life of a potter's workshop, the day often began before the clay had fully lost the coolness of night. At dusk, when we imagine the lamps being lit and the last work set aside, it is easy to picture the tools resting where they had been used since morning. Simple, familiar objects, shaped by hands as much as they shaped the clay. Across many ancient communities, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to villages along the Nile, from the Aegean shores to early settlements in China and the Americas, pottery was part of ordinary time. It belonged to meals, storage, washing, trade, and ceremony, but it also belonged to the steady rhythm of making. Clay had to be dug, carried, cleaned, softened, formed, dried, fired, and cooled. Each stage asked for patience. The earliest tools were often modest. A potter might use a smooth stone for burnishing, a piece of bone or shell for marking, a cord for cutting clay from a surface, or a wooden paddle to shape and strengthen the wall of a vessel. In many places, potters pressed woven mats, reeds, ropes, or fingers into damp clay, leaving patterns that were both useful and beautiful. These marks could help a hand grip a jar, or they might simply carry the memory of a maker's touch. Before the fast wheel became common in many parts of the ancient world, vessels were often built slowly, coil by coil. A lump of clay became a base, and then long rolls of clay were laid around it, rising in circles. The potter smoothed each join carefully, inside and out, until the vessel became whole. This method required no great machinery, only skill, attention, and a sense of balance. Even after wheels appeared, hand building continued, especially for large storage jars, cooking pots, and vessels made in households rather than specialized workshops. Where the wheel was used, it brought its own rhythm. The potter centered the clay, pressed gently, drew the walls upward, and allowed the turning motion to guide the form. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, simple turntables and later true wheels helped craftspeople make repeated shapes with calm efficiency. Bowls, cups, jars, and lamps could be made in numbers, yet each still carried small differences: a slight curve at the rim, a thumb mark near the base, a line where a tool had passed. The daily work also depended on weather. A pot made too quickly might crack. A vessel dried too fast in strong sun might split before it ever reached the kiln. So potters watched the air, the shade, and the season. They turned pots gently as they dried. They covered some pieces with cloth or leaves. They waited. By evening, the workshop would grow still. Unfired vessels might stand in rows, pale and quiet, losing moisture in the fading light. Tools would be rinsed or set aside. The kiln, if it had been fired, might still hold its deep warmth, glowing unseen beneath ash and brick. And in that warmth, the day's labor continued without motion, as clay slowly changed into pottery, and the ordinary work of hands became something enduring. Chapter 5. Small labors and patient hands. As dusk settled over early workshops, the making of pottery often became a quiet gathering of small labors. The great changes of human history can sometimes seem to belong to kings, roads, temples, and battles. But clay reminds us that much of life was shaped by hands working patiently at the edge of the firelight. A bowl, a jar, a lamp, a cooking pot. Each one began with earth softened by water, pressed, turned, smoothed, and left to dry in its own time. In many ancient villages, pottery was not made in haste. Clay had to be found in riverbanks, floodplains, or low places where fine particles had settled over many seasons. It was dug out, carried home, and cleaned of stones or roots, sometimes sand, crushed shell, old broken pottery, or plant fiber was mixed in, helping the clay survive drying and firing. These added materials, called temper by archaeologists, were humble and practical. They gave strength to the vessel, just as ordinary habits give strength to a household. Before the widespread use of the potter's wheel, many vessels were built by hand. A maker might begin with a small rounded base, then add coils of clay, one above another, pressing them together slowly. The walls rose in circles, not perfectly at first, but with care. Fingers pinched and joined. A smooth stone, a piece of wood, or a damp hand refined the surface. The rim was evened. The curve was considered. In this way, a pot grew like a quiet thought, layer by layer. The wheel, which appeared in parts of the ancient Near East by the 4th millennium BCE and spread gradually through many regions, did not end the need for patience. It changed the rhythm. The turning motion helped potters shape vessels more evenly and more quickly, yet the work still depended on touch. The hands had to feel the center of the clay. Too much pressure, and the wall might lean or collapse. Too little, and the form would remain heavy. Even with a wheel, pottery asked for balance. Many finished pots carried simple marks of their making. Some were burnished until they caught a soft sheen. Others were brushed with slips, thin mixtures of clay and water, tinted by minerals in the earth. Some were decorated with combed lines, cord impressions, painted bands, or gentle incisions. These patterns were not always grand symbols. Often they were familiar gestures, learned from parents, neighbors, or fellow workers, repeated until they became part of local tradition. Drying was another patient stage. A pot that looked complete was still fragile. If placed too near strong heat, it might crack. If fired before the moisture had left it, it could burst in the kiln or pit. So vessels waited in shade, under roofs, or near warm walls, resting while evening air moved around them. By the time the kiln was prepared, much of the labor had already been done. The lifting, mixing, shaping, smoothing, and weighting were all hidden inside the finished form. When we look at an ancient pot now, behind glass, or in a quiet photograph, we are seeing not only an object, but a record of careful hours. It holds the memory of small tasks completed without hurry, and of patient hands that knew the temper of clay, the pull of gravity, and the slow kindness of time. Chapter 6: Meals, Markets, and Shared Time. As evening settled over towns and villages, pottery often came to rest at the center of ordinary life. A bowl set beside the hearth, a jar near the doorway, a cup passed from one hand to another. These were simple objects, but they helped shape the quiet rhythm of meals, markets, and shared time. In many ancient households, clay vessels were used so often that they became almost invisible. They held grain, olives, lentils, fish sauce, wine, beer, oil, water, and milk. Some were plain and rough, made for daily use. Others were smoothed, painted, or burnished until they caught the last light of the day. A family might gather around a low table or sit near a fire, serving food from a wide dish whose surface had been darkened by years of use. The vessel did not call attention to itself. It simply made the meal possible. Markets, too, depended on pottery. In the ancient Mediterranean, amphorae carried wine and olive oil across long distances by ship. Their pointed bases fit into racks or sand, and their stamped handles sometimes marked the workshop, region, or official measure. In Mesopotamia, clay jars and bowls served in temples, homes, and storehouses, helping people measure, preserve, and exchange food. In China, finely made ceramics traveled along roads and rivers, from kilns to towns, from towns to courts, and eventually across seas. A pot could begin in the hands of a local maker and end far away, in a household whose language the maker would never hear. Yet for most people, pottery was not rare or distant. It belonged to the work of each day. A market vendor might scoop grain into a clay measure. A cook might lift the lid from a stew pot and let the steam rise into the cooling air. A child might drink from a small cup shaped by someone in the same valley. The forms were familiar because they answered familiar needs: carrying, pouring, storing, baking, sharing. In many places, pottery also marked occasions of hospitality. To offer water, wine, tea, or food in a vessel was to welcome another person into a moment of care. The cup or bowl became part of the gesture. Its weight in the hand, its warmth, its rounded edge, all helped make the exchange tangible. History often remembers rulers, wars, and monuments, but shared meals leave their own quiet record in clay. The worn rim, the soot-blackened base, the repaired crack, the vessel buried carefully when it could no longer serve. At dusk, when work slowed and fires were tended, these objects gathered people together. They carried the day's harvest into the evening meal. They held the soup, the bread, the oil, the fruit, the drink. They waited patiently on shelves and floors, durable but humble, shaped by earth and flame. And so the history of pottery is also a history of companionship. It is the history of hands meeting around the same table, of goods carried to market, of neighbors trading, families eating, and communities settling into the soft, repeated customs of evening. Chapter 7: Travelers, Letters, and News. As evening settled over roads and harbors, pottery often traveled farther than the hands that shaped it. A jar made in one town might be carried by cart to market beyond the hills, or packed in straw and lowered into the hold of a ship, where it rested among sacks of grain, coils of rope, and folded cloth. In this way, clay became part of the quiet movement of the world. Potters did not always know where their vessels would end their journeys. A bowl might be bought by a household nearby, used each morning for porridge or broth. Another might cross a river, pass through several towns, and arrive in a place where the clay was a different color, and the local kilns burned with another kind of fuel. There, someone might turn it in their hands and notice its shape, its glaze, or the way the rim curved gently outward. Long before printed newspapers became common, news moved with travelers. Merchants, pilgrims, sailors, soldiers, and messengers carried stories from one place to another. They spoke of harvests, taxes, royal marriages, wars far away, ships lost or returned, and the price of salt. At inns and marketplaces, people listened while cups were filled and bowls were set down on wooden tables. Pottery was present in these exchanges, not as a speaker, but as a familiar companion to conversation. Letters, too, carried news. In many parts of the ancient and medieval world, messages were written on papyrus, parchment, paper, wax tablets, or sometimes even on broken pieces of pottery. These broken shards, called ostraca, were useful because they were easy to find and cost almost nothing. In Egypt, Greece, and other places around the Mediterranean, people used them for notes, receipts, school exercises, lists, and brief instructions. A fragment from a broken jar could hold a few lines of everyday life, preserved by chance for centuries. Such scraps remind us that history is not only made of grand records, it is also made of small accounts, a measure of oil delivered, a name written carefully, a request sent from one person to another. The clay, once shaped for storage or serving, found a second life as a surface for words. Even broken, it remained useful. Travel also carried techniques. A potter might see a vessel from another region and remember its proportions. A trader might describe a kiln that reached a steadier heat, or a glaze that shone green in the light. Ideas did not move all at once. They drifted slowly, like smoke in the evening air. A handle shape, a painted pattern, or a firing method might take years, even generations, to settle into a new workshop. Along the Silk Roads, ceramics moved beside silk, spices, metals, and manuscripts. Chinese porcelain, admired for its pale strength and delicate surface, traveled westward and became an object of curiosity and desire. In return, distant markets and tastes influenced what potters made for export. Bowls and dishes might be shaped with foreign customers in mind, their designs adjusted for people the makers would never meet. At dusk, a kiln yard near a road might have heard many passing sounds: hoofbeats, wheels, distant voices, the creak of loaded carts. Inside the workshop, clay waited under damp cloth. Finished jars stood in rows, ready to leave. Some would remain close to home. Others would become travelers, carrying grain, wine, oil, water, or simply the quiet evidence of human making. And as night gathered, the world's news moved on softly from hand to hand. Chapter 8: Evening Work and Lamplight. As the day softened into evening, the potter's workshop grew quieter, though the work itself was not yet finished. Across many centuries, in villages, towns, and small courtyards near the edges of fields, clay often kept its own gentle timetable. It waited in damp heaps beneath cloth, rested in shallow pits, or lay covered in jars to keep it from drying too quickly. When the heat of the afternoon had passed, hands returned to it with a slower rhythm. In ancient workshops beside the Nile, along the rivers of Mesopotamia, in the towns of Greece, China, Japan, and countless other places, evening was a practical and peaceful hour. The strongest light of the sun had faded, but there was still enough glow to judge the curve of a vessel, the thickness of a rim, or the steadiness of a handle newly attached. A potter might sit near the doorway, where the last brightness lingered, turning a cup in the hand and smoothing away the faint marks left by fingers. Lamplight changed the room. A small flame, fed by oil or fat, did not fill the workshop as daylight did. It gathered the world into little circles. Within one circle, a bowl might rest upside down, firming slowly. Within another, a shelf of jars waited to be trimmed in the morning. Shadows moved softly over wheel, bench, water jar, and tools of bone, wood, shell, or metal. The work became less hurried, more attentive. Evening tasks were often the careful ones. Leather-hard pots, no longer wet but not yet fully dry, could be trimmed with a sharp edge. Extra clay was shaved away from the base, and the foot of a vessel was given its quiet shape. Handles could be joined, spouts refined, lids matched to their jars. A slip of liquid clay might be brushed across a surface, pale or red or dark, preparing it for burnishing, painting, or firing. In some traditions, decoration belonged naturally to these still hours. Lines were drawn with calm repetition. A comb might press small patterns around a shoulder. A brush might leave bands, waves, leaves, or signs, whose meanings belonged to the people who made and used them. In other workshops, the beauty remained in proportion alone. A swelling jar, a balanced bowl, a plain cup made to sit well in the hand. Nearby, the kiln stood quiet or warming, depending on the season and the need. Firing was often watched carefully, but not every evening was a firing night. Many evenings were only preparation, stacking dry fuel, checking vents, moving finished pots away from dampness, listening to the small sounds of clay contracting as it dried. The potter knew that haste could crack what patience might preserve. Outside, dusk settled over rooftops, fields, and paths worn smooth by many feet. People came and went with ordinary vessels: water jars, cooking pots, storage crocks, lamps, bowls for grain, cups for tea or wine or broth. Pottery belonged to daily life so completely that it could seem almost invisible. Yet in the Lamplight workshop, each piece had passed through care, pressure, waiting, and touch. As night deepened, tools were rinsed, scraps of clay gathered, and damp cloths laid over unfinished work. The wheel grew still. The lamp burned lower. In the soft darkness, the vessels rested on shelves and boards, holding their shapes through the cool hours, while the workshop slept beside them. Chapter 9. What was remembered? By the time the kiln had cooled, and the last warmth had faded from its brick or clay walls, pottery had already begun its quiet work of remembering. A vessel might stand on a shelf, filled with grain or oil, water or wine. A bowl might rest near the hearth, used each evening until the touch of many hands made its rim smooth. A jar might be sealed and stored beneath the floor, safe in the dimness of a house. These objects were made for use, and yet, over time, they held more than what was placed inside them. They held the shape of a day. In many early villages, pottery became part of ordinary life so gradually that no single moment announced its importance. A clay pot did not speak loudly. It simply waited, ready to serve. It made it easier to cook lentils until they softened, to carry water from a spring, to keep seeds dry through the winter months. It allowed food to be shared, stored, and returned to. In this way, pottery helped bind households to seasons, and seasons to memory. The clay itself remembered as well. It remembered the riverbank where it was dug, the fine sand mixed into it, the pressure of thumbs, the turning of a wheel, the steady scraping of a tool. When fired, these traces became firm. Even after a pot was broken, they remained. A shard could keep the curve of a vessel's shoulder, the print of a reed mat, or the dark line of smoke from a kiln that had breathed unevenly on a cool evening. For historians and archaeologists, these fragments have become some of the gentlest witnesses of the past. Wood rots away, cloth disappears, spoken names are lost, but fired clay often stays in the earth, patient and unhurried. It may lie beneath fields, under streets, near the remains of old ovens, wells, or walls. Centuries pass above it. Rain falls, roots grow, houses rise and fall, and still a small piece of pottery remains, keeping its modest record. From such pieces, people have learned where communities traded, what they cooked, how they stored their harvests, and what designs pleased their eyes. A painted line, a combed pattern, a glaze, a fingerprint hardened by fire, all can become part of a larger remembering. Not dramatic, not complete, but tenderly useful. Some pots were remembered within families, passed from hand to hand until they cracked or were mended. Others were placed with the dead, carrying food, drink, or symbols of care into burial places. In ancient Egypt, in Greece, in China, in the Americas, and in countless other regions, vessels accompanied human hopes with quiet dignity. They stood near the body, still and watchful, shaped by the living for someone who had gone beyond reach. At dusk, a potter might have looked over the day's finished work and seen not history, but usefulness. A row of jars, a stack of bowls, a few cups cooling in the fading light. Yet these simple forms would outlast many voices. They would carry forward the memory of hands, homes, fires, meals, and small acts of care. And so pottery remembered without trying. It remembered through clay, through shape, through the soft endurance of fired earth. It kept what it could and let the rest settle gently into silence. Chapter 10. Night settles in. Night settles gently over the potter's yard, and the clay, shaped by patient hands, rests in rows beneath the dimming sky. The day's work has become quiet. Bowls, jars, cups, and tiles no longer turn on the wheel or pass from palm to palm. They sit still, drying at their own unhurried pace, holding within them the memory of water, earth, and touch. In many old villages, this hour was familiar. Across river valleys, islands, plains, and walled towns, potters learned to work with the rhythm of evening. Clay could not be hurried. If it dried too quickly, it might crack. If it stayed too damp, it would slump or lose its form. So the maker watched the air, the season, the wind, and the color of the surface. A vessel becoming leather hard had a particular look, a quiet dullness, a firmness beneath the fingertip. This knowledge was rarely written down. It passed from one generation to another in workshops, courtyards, and family kilns. By dusk, the kiln might still be warm from an earlier firing, or it might be packed and waiting for the next careful burn. Early kilns were often simple structures of earth, stone, or brick, built to guide heat around the pots more evenly than an open fire could. Over centuries, potters refined their kilns with draft openings, chambers, fireboxes, and vents. In China, long sloping dragon kilns climbed hillsides, drawing flames through stacked vessels. In Japan, anagama kilns held ash and flame in long, earthen tunnels. Around the Mediterranean, updraft kilns lifted heat through chambers where amphory, lamps, and tableware slowly transformed. The transformation itself was quiet but profound. Clay, once soft enough to bend, became ceramic, strong enough to carry grain, oil, wine, water, salt, and stories. In the heat, particles fused, minerals shifted. Iron might blush red or brown. Ash might settle into a natural glaze. A plain surface could emerge with marks of flame, smoke, and chance. Yet to the potter at night, before the kiln was opened, all of this remained hidden. So there was waiting. Waiting was part of the craft as surely as kneading, throwing, coiling, trimming, or glazing. A kiln could not be opened while too hot, or the sudden rush of cooler air might crack the work inside. The potter had to trust the sealed chamber, the slow falling temperature, and the experience built over many firings. Outside, under the deepening sky, tools were washed, clay was covered, and scraps were set aside to soften again in water. In the fading light, pottery belonged not only to trade or utility, but to the long household life of human beings. A jar near the door, a cup beside a mat, a cooking pot near the hearth, a lamp waiting for oil. These humble objects shaped the evenings of countless people whose names are gone, but whose hands understood the comfort of a well-made vessel. And as night comes fully in, the kiln yard grows still. The last warmth gathers in the bricks. The clay sleeps in darkness, becoming what it is meant to become, while the potter rests nearby, listening to the soft world settle. Chapter 11. What remains? Long after the hands have gone still, pottery remains. It rests in the earth with a patience that few other human things possess. Wood softens and returns to soil. Cloth loosens thread by thread. Metal may bend, tarnish, or be carried away and shaped again. But a piece of fired clay, once transformed in the heat of a kiln or open fire, often keeps its quiet form for thousands of years. Even when broken, it does not vanish easily. A rim, a handle, the curve of a bowl, the foot of a jar, these small fragments wait beneath fields, beneath courtyards, beneath the floors of old houses, holding the memory of daily life. For archaeologists, pottery is one of the most faithful companions in the study of the past. A shard may seem modest, no larger than a fallen leaf, but it can speak softly of where people lived, what they stored, what they cooked, and how they traded. The clay itself may carry traces of local minerals. The shape may show a familiar tradition, passed from hand to hand through generations. A painted line, a stamped mark, or the pattern of a potter's fingers can suggest a workshop, a village, or a road between distant towns. In ancient kitchens, pots blackened over fire. In storerooms, great jars held grain, olive oil, wine, water, or salted fish. In markets, small lamps, cups, and bowls passed from cellar to buyer. Some vessels were made with great care for ceremony or burial. Others were plain, made quickly and used until they cracked. Yet both kinds remain. The treasured vase and the everyday cooking pot may lie near one another in the soil, equally quiet, equally enduring. Across the Mediterranean, broken amphorae once piled up near harbors and warehouses, reminders of journeys by sea. In China, kiln sites left behind mountains of test pieces, misfires, and shards of porcelain, each one part of a long search for whiteness, strength, and light. In the Americas, fragments of painted bowls and storage jars help trace communities, foodways, and the movement of ideas across broad landscapes. In Africa, Europe, and Asia, humble pieces of pottery mark settlement layers like pages in a very slow book. What remains is not only the object, but the gesture. The thumb smoothing a coil, the cord pressed around a jar, the brush moving across a pale surface, the careful stacking of vessels before firing, the waiting beside a kiln as dusk settled and heat gathered in the chamber. These moments were ordinary once. They belonged to workdays, to family life, to meals, to weather, to seasons. Now they come back to us in fragments, softened by time but not erased. Pottery teaches a gentle lesson about endurance. It was made from earth and water, shaped by human attention, hardened by fire, and returned at last to the ground. It reminds us that much of history is not made only of kings, battles, or monuments, but of bowls set on tables, jars carried from wells, lamps lit in the evening, and hands that knew the feel of clay. At dusk, when the day's colors fade and the world grows quieter, it is easy to imagine these vessels at rest. Some whole, some broken, some still buried in darkness. They are not waiting impatiently. They simply remain, carrying the calm weight of use, touch, and time. Chapter 12. Soft Ending. As evening settles over the long history of pottery, the kiln grows quiet. Its last warmth lingers in the brick, in the ash, and in the shelves where vessels have cooled from fire into stillness. What began as soft earth, shaped by hands and water, has passed through heat and time, and now rests with the calm patience of stone. Across many centuries, potters have known this ending well. In ancient river valleys, in hillside villages, in workshops beside markets and monasteries, the closing of a firing was never hurried. A kiln could not simply be opened at once. The vessels inside needed time to settle. Too sudden a change, and a bowl might crack. Too much eagerness, and the careful work of many days could be lost. So the potter waited, listening to the quiet tick of cooling clay, trusting the slow return of warmth to air. This waiting was part of the craft. It belonged to the same rhythm as digging clay from a riverbank, wedging it beneath the palms, turning it on a wheel, brushing it with slip, painting a line of iron or cobalt, and setting it gently aside to dry. Each stage asked for attention, but also for patience. Pottery was shaped by skill, yet it was completed by time. In the dim light after sunset, the vessels might be lifted out one by one. Some were plain storage jars, made for grain, oil, water, or wine. Some were small lamps, ready to hold a little flame. Some were tiles for roofs, pipes for drains, cups for tea, bowls for rice, plates for bread, or jars for pickled fruit. Many would pass quietly into daily use, touched so often that their makers' names would never be known. Yet their forms carried a record of human care. The history of pottery is, in this way, a gentle history of ordinary life. It follows meals, hearths, gardens, trade roads, and kitchens. It travels with merchants across seas, rests in tombs, sits on shelves, and returns to the ground in fragments. Archaeologists have learned much from these fragments: what people cooked, what they carried, how they traded, how they decorated the useful things around them. A broken rim, a painted shard, or a bit of kiln was enough to suggest a vanished workshop, a household, or a road once used by many feet. And still, the oldest lessons remain simple. Clay changes, but slowly. Fire transforms, but only after steady preparation. A vessel becomes strong not by force alone, but by being given the right conditions, the right heat, and the right rest afterward. Now the dusk deepens. The workshop is swept. The wheel is still. Outside, the earth that gave the clay is dark and cool again. Somewhere, a finished bowl waits for morning light, holding nothing yet, but ready. Its curve is quiet. Its surface remembers water, hand, flame, and ash. And the kiln, having done its work, keeps only a little warmth. It fades gradually into the night, like an ember under ash, like a thought becoming sleep.